Well, thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction, and thank you very much indeed for giving me the opportunity this afternoon. I'm privileged to be able to speak to you all today, so thank you very much indeed to the Institute and to the PMI for co-marketing the event. For the next 40 minutes, I'm going to give you an introduction to a systemic approach to strategy execution that optimizes business performance and competitive advantage. Please let me set your expectations. This is an introduction. It's an overview. To understand it well enough to be able to use it and deliver some business benefits takes a few days of learning, some practice, some feedback, and some coaching and application. Certainly all the slides that you'll see this afternoon will be made available for you later. There is a caveat that I'd like to start with. What you are about to see is really some slides, and you'll hear some words of me talking about some concepts and ideas. Please don't think that this is the mechanism that I will use to enable leaders in client organizations not just to understand, but to value and to want to use the concepts that I'm going to introduce you to. Leadership is best developed by doing, and the bullet points on this slide give an outline of our development methodology. And I'll touch on this again at the end, and you can see the full methodology explained on the Tozer Consulting website. This is what I'm going to talk about today: the context of failure and success, the conditions for success, the systemic causes of ineffective strategy execution, what I call fog and friction, how to overcome this fog and friction on a dynamic and systemic basis, how leadership is integrated in organizations, and very briefly I'll give you a few execution capability learning and development considerations, and then I'll take any questions you have at the end. Statistically, your organization will fail to realize its potential. I don't intend to read all these bullet points out, but I'm sure that you can relate to them. The worrying thing is that 10 years ago I could have produced a similar slide with similar research conclusions reached over the preceding 5 to 10 years. It seems that crossing the gap between strategy development in the corporate headquarters boardroom and execution on the front line remains an intractable problem for many organizations. Again, I don't intend to read all these bullet points out, but I'd like you to get a feel for what is possible if you adopt the sort of things that I will be outlining to you this afternoon. And all of these results were obtained using the approach that you're going to get an introduction to. And I think you might agree that some of them are quite impressive results achieved in a very short period of time. Let me explain what I mean by the conditions for success. Any individual, team or organization needs 3 preconditions to be in place in order to be successful. And I call those the ACE conditions for success. Ability. Ability is a function of knowledge and skill applied with the appropriate behavior and attitude. You might call it flexible leadership style or emotional intelligence, together with the right level of intellect for the level of work and complexity faced. Clarity. Clarity is a function of 2 factors: the right information and the effective understanding of that information to enable activity that is aligned to the higher intent. And I'll come back to this in a moment. And finally, environment. Environment comprises both the infrastructure of the workplace as well as the example of its leaders. So policies, systems, processes, organizational structure, workplace layout and resources, products and services that employees have confidence in, the example of leaders, trust, the beliefs and myths that shape the way things are done are all part of environment. And the most important part of most people's environment is the behavior of their immediate boss. Together, these 3 elements, ability, clarity, environment, create your business's capability and deliver results and create reputation. Let me outline some other key points about this. ACE is both a leader's job description that can apply to every level and a diagnostic. Creating or developing ACE is a leader's responsibility, and when the components of ACE are expanded in detail, ACE becomes a diagnostic of effectiveness and the reasons for business performance. The ACE conditions for a team reflects the leader's own ability to create them, and the more senior the leader is, the more the leader is capable of shaping the environment that other people have to work in. Clarity is the area in which most rapid performance improvement may be made, and how a leader creates this clarity plays a significant part in creating emotional engagement. The environment that people work within, all those things I outlined a moment ago, can shape or induce up to 70% of behaviour in organisations, including things that you see as automatic responses. Motivation, empowerment and communication are big words that lots of consultants use, but rarely define. And if you think about it, these three things have elements that span all three areas of ACE. I said I'd come back to clarity and emotional engagement. Clarity means alignment to higher intent, so that your priorities of work match those that the chief executive would set for you if he or she could be present to give you that direction. And it means an effective understanding of that higher intent or purpose, so that you can adapt your plans and priorities as the situation changes. Understanding is a combination of insights, being aware of the situation and analysing it, and foresight, which means using deductive thinking and applying wisdom in your decision making. While increased clarity alone will make a dramatic improvement to performance, when it is combined with emotional engagement, that is when the business really starts to perform. And emotional engagement means engendering willing accountability for tasks with commitment to the plan and to the organisation itself, and securing people's discretionary effort, the willingness to go that extra mile to do the very best that they may. Let's look now at the causes of ineffective strategy execution. Quite often, an analogy is made between large organisations and a large, slow-moving ship at sea. The ship is a self-contained system with the captain on the bridge, and when he orders starboard 20, perhaps half an hour later, the ship has changed direction. And when he orders stop engines, 2 miles later, the tanker comes to a halt. I don't think this is a very useful analogy for large organisations today. Is this more like your business world? I'd suggest that probably it is. A number of geographically dispersed business units, hopefully working in concert to reach a common destination, but each with its own localised operating environment as well as global market conditions to contend with. So let's explore this a little bit further. Your external operating environment is shaped by many things. The economy, your competitors, your customers, the market itself, social demographics, what technology makes possible, risks of currency fluctuations, food, water and energy security, and so on. There is also the paradox of globalization and fragmentation to contend with. Large organizations understandably want to centralize or standardize many things, from products to business processes. But at the same time, we are seeing increased demand for localization of decision-making and fragmentation in the face of monolithic homogeneity. And you may observe this happening to the European Union. And you're all experiencing an exponential rate of change that shows little sign of slowing down. In recent years, business writers have used a military expression coined about 15 years ago to describe all of this. VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I describe this more simply as the fog of war, and your approach to strategy execution must embrace and exploit working with this fog if you are to be successful in the market and to be able to outflank your competitors. In addition to this fog, we have friction to contend with. Friction is the force that makes what should be simple to do difficult, and makes the difficult seemingly impossible. It manifests itself at both the organisational and individual levels, and I'm sure that you can relate to some of these examples. In outline, friction is created by different national cultures and norms of behaviour, independent wills, individual motivations, agendas and interests, imperfect information and imperfect decision making, and unclear language and communication, which I shall come back to in a moment. Stress, caused by fear, worry and anxiety. Exertion, both physical and mental. People are working longer and longer hours these days. And chance events, things which will inevitably happen but which cannot really be planned for. I said I would come back to imperfect information and unclear communication. Let's look at how organisations generally go about developing and implementing strategy. More often than not, a vision, a long-term objective or a future end state will be conceived, and the outline plan or strategy to achieve it will be defined, sometimes through long hard thinking and discussion, sometimes on a whim because other organisations are doing something similar, and I have seen that. In some organisations, this strategy then has an infinite amount of detail added to it before it is emailed to the world. In other organisations, no detail is added at all, but the outlined strategy is printed in glossy brochures and left in reception for visitors to read. I might sound cynical, but I have seen all of this, and on more than one occasion. Why is it then that so many plans do not achieve the results that are envisaged, or make the change that is wished for? Let's look at the systemic reasons for failure rather than individual motivational or personality-based reasons which many other researchers and writers have already explored. The first gap in effective execution is the use of imperfect or incomplete information in decision-making and/or the use of an imperfect decision-making process. Imperfect information includes a lack of information, false assumptions rather than valid deductions made from evidence, and false assumptions based on past experience of similar but not identical situations. An imperfect decision-making process includes both irrational decision-making, such as plucking a preferred course of action out of thin air, and making decisions without an effective process to engage those people who need to be engaged, something I call social process. We will look at an effective method for decision-making in a few minutes. The second gap is very similar to the first, and unlike some organisations with which I have worked, I clearly differentiate strategic decision-making from planning. Decision-making results in the clarification of objectives and priorities and the selection of an overall or outline plan from the options which exist. Planning, or action planning, or execution planning if you prefer, defines roles, allocates tasks, defines coordinating instructions, organises logistics support and so on to the level of detail required by the next level down in the organisation, not to the nth degree. The third gap is the imperfect dissemination of plans, which means that people are not told that which they should be told, or it is the imperfect interpretation of plans and intentions as communicated, which means that either unclear and ambiguous language was used to communicate the plan, or the recipient's perception changed its meaning, and no check was made for common understanding. The result of these three gaps means that the actual work priorities and actions of people at the front line are not the actions desired by the executives who defined the strategy in the first place. Add to this the dynamics of the market, and it will not be a surprise that there is a gap between expected or desired results and outcomes and actual results. In addition to these systemic leadership practices causes of friction, we also have the environmental friction to contend with from policies, processes, structure and so on, which shape undesired or dysfunctional behaviour. Unfortunately, we do not have time to explore this further this afternoon. So how do we overcome this fog and friction? Let's look at a systemic approach to executing strategy that does not rely on micromanagement or other management norms and fads which have clearly failed, but which instead relies on leading through leaders to decentralize execution in this VUCA world, but maintain alignment to centralized intent. The external environment and your organization itself are both what academics would call non-linear, complex, adaptive systems. Such systems can be chaotic and unpredictable, but are not random. And as the boundaries of such systems are reduced in time and scope, the system acts more linearly and predictably. So a systemic approach to strategy execution needs to break strategy down into smaller, more manageable parts, limit the impact of fog through more effective decision-making, maximize organizational agility by minimizing internal friction, and this requires leaders distributed through the structure who are able to use a systematic approach to their own decision-making and planning. Such a systematic approach needs to engage people through purpose, autonomy, mastery, and dialogue, which research tells us is essential, and the system must be trust-inducing because trust is the social glue that holds organizations together. A properly designed systematic approach will also dynamically adjust and adapt in the face of actual progress in the execution of plans and to changed circumstances outside the organization. The good news is that such an approach exists already, the well-proven philosophy of mission-focused leadership. I can't claim to have originated it. The approach has historical roots going back to the early 1800s, which we can talk about later if you want. But I think I am the first to have written about its use in business, and I can certainly claim to have spent 20 years developing the thinking by applying it in organizations around the world. Suffice it to say that this is a highly effective way of executing strategy, well proven in the public and private sectors and across cultures. It has evolved through practical trial and error and only recently became the subject of academic examination. The approach is systematic and may be embedded into organizations. It increases predictability, easily scales as organizations grow or reconfigure, and because it is based on first principles, it is durable over time and not a flash-in-the-pan fad to be replaced by the next pop psychology book that a senior executive reads on a long-haul flight. It assists in integrating leadership because it exploits the similarities in leadership at different levels in different functions. An organization keeps itself focused and keeps things as simple as possible by having one mission, and I'll talk about what I mean by mission in a moment. Strategy is broken down into smaller, more manageable, localized and achievable missions at business unit, department, team and individual level. Now this is not all done by the CEO defining all these lower level missions him or herself, but by having an organizational structure which distributes leaders throughout the organization, and by those leaders applying some simple common disciplines and practices which create clarity and emotional engagement on a dynamic basis. I use the term mission in a very specific sense, and I'll define that for you now. A mission statement, to me, is a short, clear, concise, and unambiguous statement of overall intent and the purpose to be fulfilled by achieving that intent. It is a combination of a very clear what and a very clear reason why. The value of purpose is not well understood in many organizations, and I draw your attention to the seminal 1994 research publication by Collins and Porras, a book called Built to Last, and a more recent 5-year research project of Professor Andrew Kakabadze at Henley, a colleague of mine, published earlier this year in a book called The Success Factor. There is also a fabulous YouTube video by Daniel Pink, who will really give you a clear understanding of the value of purpose, mastery, and autonomy. Purpose creates meaning for people, and a noble or worthwhile purpose is inspiring in itself. Purpose sets context for decisions and therefore influences choices, and it legitimizes requests made of others. So I think, or I hope you can see the value of a mission statement combining both the what and the why, the intent and its purpose. Now, this is the basic cycle of leadership practices or disciplines which together create the clarity and emotional engagement needed to define and achieve the mission. The intellectual rigor of the method creates the clarity needed. The social process used, in other words, facilitation, open questioning, dialogue, and integrating all that input, secures emotional engagement. Decision-making, using a method I'll introduce called the appreciation, clarifies the mission and defines the outline plan at any level. The involvement of stakeholders will secure their support for the decision, and effective decisions are informed by intelligence, not guesswork, and intelligence is information that has been assessed, analysed, and interpreted. Planning creates the level of detail required for activity at the next level down. Briefing is a formal leadership communication discipline in which the plan is disseminated and, importantly, a check is made to ensure understanding and common interpretation, which means open questions and more dialogue, not simply asking, "Are you clear?" Even if people have been involved in the decision making and planning, they need to be briefed on the final plan before execution, as things change and important points are forgotten, and a strategic plan may be put together over a period of weeks. Execution starts when a leader at one level briefs a subordinate leader in the next level down and creates shared context. A briefing should include the situation or operating context, the superior leader's own mission and his or her outlined plan, and the subordinate leader's role and delegated tasks, freedom of action, and any constraints or limitations that the subordinate leaders should work under and their allocated resources. This defines their operating and decision-making space. Essentially, the superior leader is briefing the subordinate on what to achieve and why, and with what resources, but leaves determining how a task is to be achieved to that subordinate leader, who will make the decision on how best to do that with his or her team. And these decisions are all most effectively made by making an appreciation, and I'll outline this to you now. All of life and work is a series of layered, concurrent, and consecutive problems to solve and decisions to make. Some problems are called projects, others are called tasks, challenges, obstacles, or opportunities. Hence, decision-making is a critical skill, and this, I suggest, is the fundamental method to employ. Step 1, I call mission analysis. It is an examination of the higher intent 1 and 2 levels up. That is to say, you understand your boss's and your boss's boss's intentions, and you think about the tasks delegated to you, implied tasks that may not have been specified, and the specific effects that you wish to have and on whom or on what. This clarifies with laser precision exactly what you're trying to achieve and why, and defines your mission. This is confirmed with a back brief to your boss, where you ensure mutual understanding and you have an opportunity to make clear the implications of any direction that you've been given. But if your boss is not available and you're unable to give the back brief, then you can proceed knowing that you have created the best degree of clarity that you can about what to achieve and why. Step 2 involves listing and then analysing all the factors that affect achieving your mission. A factor is anything that affects achieving your mission, and it's analysed by saying, so what? So what does this mean? What can I deduce from this? Therefore, what do I need to do about it? This deductive thought process, or discussion process, distills complexity to simplicity, eliminates clutter, and results in a prioritised list of essential tasks that need to be completed in order to achieve the mission. Step 3 means identifying and comparing all the different courses of action or outlined plans, which enable those priority tasks to be achieved. This might be the different ways of grouping and sequencing tasks, different ways of completing key tasks themselves, which is determined by an appreciation conducted at a lower level, and or by reconfiguring team or organisational structures. Step 4 is a decision when the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of each option are compared and a selection is made. Now, while the appreciation starts with mission analysis, this is not a linear process in which one step has to be completed before you move on. You can move forward and back around this cycle as time and information allows. I should also point out that this process does not exist to slow decision-making down. Rather, it is here to help make the best possible decision that you can with the time and information available. The best decision made too late is worse than an 80% decision made in a timely manner. Now, this thought process can be applied at the strategic level when a deliberate appreciation might be made. This can be through a number of formal and documented meetings with a large document created as a result, or it can be conducted on the spot at the tactical level, perhaps 30 seconds in your head or a quick discussion in which 4 key questions are asked. What are we trying to achieve and why? What affects achieving it and what's that mean? What are the options? Which is the best option? Once an appreciation has been made, if the nature of the task or degree of complexity warrants it, then the outline plan needs to have additional detail added to create an actionable plan. A logical progression of headings in a common format, intelligently applied at every level, makes it easy for leaders to remember what needs to be incorporated into an effective plan, and it makes it easy for others to understand it. I shan't dwell on the headings here, and you'll see more detail in the slides you can access after this webinar. But I will make the point that if the plan is not simple, it will not be clear. If it is not clear, it will not be understood. And if it is not understood, it will not be done. Certainly at a strategic level, the output of an appreciation, the outline plan, may be represented in a schematic format, with all the tasks and decision points sequenced along lines of activity. This is a one-page plan that makes briefing relatively simple. Ideally, these lines of activity are reflected in your structure, because structure exists to enable execution, not to hinder it. The major tasks and projects on the different lines of activity mean that leading indicators on a range of balance measures along those various lines may be determined. So for those of you who favour balanced scorecards, you can now see how a balanced scorecard can be very effectively created through a rigorous planning process and presented in a format which makes tracking progress possible. The same thought process which produced a strategic plan, the appreciation, should be applied to each and every task or decision point on the plan, and this idea iterates and cascades down through the organisation. This maintains alignment, creates clarity and engagement all the way down the organisation, and creates line of sight from the boardroom to the front line. Now, time precludes a detailed examination of this and prevents me showing you some examples, but if you buy the book Leading Through Leaders, you can see a number of real client examples in there with the results produced. Having facilitated an appreciation and whatever action planning is required, the last step before execution is briefing. To assume that because people have been involved in planning that they understand the plan in outline and their role in detail is a very dangerous assumption. A briefing needs to be face-to-face or at least done over the telephone, because not only is information disseminated, its understanding needs to be checked and the leader needs to project his or her personality and instill confidence and belief in the team. Emailing a plan is not a briefing nor a substitute for briefing, nor is printing expensive brochures and leaving them around the place. And while in many organizations that I've worked with there have been obvious flaws with their decision-making process, interestingly, action planning is the practice most effectively done. Briefing is arguably the leadership discipline most noticeable by its absence. Unlike the previous two steps of the appreciation and action planning, which may be facilitated, an effective briefing is not a discussion. It is a clear, succinct and clarifying summary of the plan delivered in such a way that the leader can impose some personality and build confidence. The slides that you can access later will show a suggested template. The most important part, or one of the most important parts of the briefing, is the way it ends. In most business meetings, you will probably end with someone asking, "Have you got any questions?" To which the answer is invariably no, because you're bored and want to get out of the room and do other things. A briefing ends with open questions from and then to the team, and an open question involves the words what, why, how, who, when, where, and so on. Questions to the teams, such as what will you do, to each individual, allows the leader to check for understanding, engage in some dialogue, and the response is likely to secure more individual commitment and accountability. When someone says, "I'm going to do something in public in front of the whole team," they are more likely to do it. The bigger that organizations are, the more easily that three distinct bands of leadership may be observed, perhaps with 2 or 3 levels of leadership within each of these bands. Strategic leaders are primarily concerned with defining and promoting vision, purpose, values, strategy, policy, and so on. Operational leaders are the middle managers in corporate offices who are interpreting strategic direction and setting the context in which tactical leadership is happening. The blue of strategic leadership extends to the tactical level for 2 reasons. First, every leader at every level has some features of their role in common. The need to facilitate decision-making and planning, give briefings, coordinate, resource and coach team members, and so on. Second, if strategy is to be successful, executives need to understand and check that what is strategically desirable remains tactically possible, and if not, amend their plans accordingly. The red of tactical leadership extends upwards also for 2 reasons. First, junior leaders need to understand higher intent to set their context and define priorities and influence their decisions. And second, although they're not responsible for strategy, they may contribute to defining it. Sales forces are excellent sources of intelligence if organizations exploit their knowledge of the market and competitors and customer relationships. Leadership within an organization is partly integrated by structure. An effective structure separates work by levels of complexity and time horizon, so that the leader at one level may keep subordinate leaders working in context, but is himself or herself working further out in time, which prevents the leader from interfering too much with her subordinates' work. This approach to levels of leadership does not preclude a matrix structure. All effective organizations are matrices, but what is required is clarification of the role relationships within that matrix rather than leaving ill-defined dotted lines, which are the norm and which induce huge stress and a massive waste of time. This is a vast subject all in itself, and I thoroughly recommend the 40 years of research by the late Dr. Elliot Jacks and his body of knowledge called Requisite Organization. I said that leadership in an organization is partly integrated by structure. It is also partly integrated through common practices and expectations, and I've given you an introduction to those. What differs primarily between levels of leadership is the time horizon a leader needs to think forward to and plan for, the complexity of work that is faced, the level of responsibility felt by that leader, and the impact that the leader has on the organization and its results over time. The same leadership disciplines and practices for creating clarity, the appreciation, action planning and briefing, which we have briefly looked at, may be applied to different levels of complexity. In an organizational context, this cycle of leadership processes iterates, recurs and cascades across and down through an organization. Now this image shows a cascade in a two-level hierarchy, but the two cycles could equally well be beside each other in a flat network. A common language of leadership, common framework, and a common set of expectations facilitates ease of working. The mission analysis back briefs and regular situation and progress reviews and revisiting of mission analysis, particularly the question, has the situation changed and what does that mean, ensures that the whole system is both dynamic and self-correcting. The common framework helps to minimize the impact of the movement of people in, around, and out of the organization. It also builds trust. When leaders have confidence in how their junior leaders approach decision-making, they tend to trust them to do more, further increasing engagement and execution speed. At the start, I said I'd give you an insight into a few learning and development considerations for building your strategy execution capability. In most organizations, leadership development intends to achieve the outcomes highlighted in the blue box that you can see on the screen. However, in my experience, many approaches to leadership development and many programs fail to add lasting value, and some, perhaps many, to fail to deliver immediate value. And the bullet points in the second column seem to me to be characteristics of those sorts of programs. So a rethink is required about the approach to leadership development. Those programs that do achieve sustainable results and measurable business performance tend to include the features that I've highlighted in that right-hand column. You'll note in the right-hand column, the top line highlights the need for an organizational leadership and strategy execution philosophy and the phrase tight, loose, fit. A long-standing client came up with the phrase tight, loose, fit, meaning it was tight or disciplined enough to be consistently effective across the business, but loose enough to be sensibly and intelligently applied to different situations in different countries at different levels as the individual leader saw fit. That is essentially what I have been talking about today. And this is the last real slide. This is something for you learning and development professionals to consider and reflect upon. But it's essentially what we have proven to be a virtuous circle of experiential and applied learning that is particularly important if you wish to introduce a systematic approach to strategy execution of the type that I have given you an overview of today. What is vital is that at the start, a desire to learn or change is created, because not only are we developing individual leaders' behavior, we're also giving them a handrail to use for those core leadership practices of decision-making, planning and briefing. They obviously need to learn them in such a way that they understand them, but what's important from an organization perspective is that they're applied and applied immediately and are proven to and demonstrably shown to work, because that will build the individual leader's confidence in continuing to use them, and it will demonstrate to the organization a return on investment. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. According to my watch, that was 40 minutes, maybe 41. So over to you. Please fire away with whatever questions you have.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Tozer. You have really lived up to your military traditions by being very precise in the timings. I must appreciate that. Thank you very much. Folks, we are now open for question and answers. If you have any questions, you could put it in the question box, or you could raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on the webinar console. If you click on it, you can have an audio connection with Mr. Tozer. So let me go to the question box. There's a question: is this a very top-down driven approach? Some graphics imply that we are a flat matrix organization.
No, it's certainly doesn't. It's not an approach that has to have a top-down structure to make work. It will work in flat matrix structures. It will work in hierarchical structures, but it is most effectively used where there is some form of leadership structure in which there is clear accountability. And every organization has some sort of structure. The problem is that some organizations are too flat, which means leaders have too broad a span of control and can't make effective decisions. Others are incredibly bureaucratic organizations with too many levels. So flat is not necessarily beautiful, and certainly hierarchical is not necessarily beautiful. What I would suggest is that you have the optimum number of levels for the degrees of complexity you're facing. But certainly this is not intended to come over as a top-down driven approach. Indeed, many organizations that use this, it's been introduced at a middle level and then spread upwards, downwards and across from there with it when its success has been seen.
Okay, thank you very much. Another one: does the whole organization have to adopt this for it to work?
No, that's certainly not the case at all. One of the examples I showed earlier on was and it's a case study I wrote up in the last book as a division of Cisco, which some of you may be familiar with. That doesn't come in top down. It entered the system, if you like, with the lady that runs a customer self-help technical website, a website of 70,000 pages. Now the whole approach was introduced just with her department, and it saved, I think, 60% of the anticipated budgetary spend. They had 132 multi-million-dollar strategic projects on their books, which, when we went through the sort of process that had been through to create clarity at the strategic level, and no clarity had been created for her as she had a new boss, that got reduced down to 30-odd projects. So it doesn't need to come in at all. What does happen, though, if it comes in at a junior mid-level, is that the leader of the area in which it comes in, that particular area will be far more clear and engaged, but the leader who's introduced it will perhaps start to see some flaws elsewhere in the organization, because they become far more used to thinking clearly and asking questions and anticipating things, and they don't always have that example set from them above, and that was certainly the case with the client a fortnight ago. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me move to another one. How should strategy of an organization be communicated from top to down? Is it directly from the CEO, or a separate strategy department needs to be activated?
There is a problem, I think, with separate strategy departments, because the owner of the strategy should be the chief executive. Certainly in defining the clarity at the organizational level about what we're trying to achieve and why, a strategy department might then examine the detailed factors, if you like. So the chief executive and the top team have done the mission analysis, if I go back to that thought process of the appreciation, with a strategy department analyzing information and the factors affecting how that might be achieved, and coming up with the options from which the chief executive can choose. But if you're a very large corporate organization, the bigger the organization, the more strategy starts to become intangible, and people at the front line don't need to know the strategy that's being discussed in the boardroom. What they do need to understand is the general direction, their immediate boss's intentions and their boss's intentions. In other words, understand things 2 levels up, because that gives them the context they need to understand for their immediate work. So I don't believe that chief executives doing a vast number of strategy roadshows is particularly enlightening for most people. What matters is actually having an effective leadership structure that can take information from above and make it meaningful for the people immediately below.
Thank you very much. Another one. It looks like a project management approach to leadership. Is that right?
I can understand why that comment would be made, and in some ways, yes, it is. Projects tend to get a little bit more rigor put into clarifying what's to be achieved and how it's going to be achieved and whose role is what within that plan. So in that sense, yes, it is. And part of the problem is that the precision of thinking does not occur as a matter of course on a daily basis, with people examining what they're doing and why, which is so much change fails because all it does is introduce new work, which is piled on top of existing work, rather than going through the sort of thought process I've shown, where you come up with a list of tasks when you've analysed factors, for example, and you compare that to what you're currently doing in terms of stop, start, and carry on doing. So yes, there is an element of project management about it, but I don't see why project management should be any different from leading day-to-day operations. There might be more complexity in some projects, but the same suite of leadership practices, I'd suggest, should be applied to both day-to-day tactical work and project work.
Okay, sir, and we have one last question. It doesn't look like there is much emphasis on authentic leadership behavior, or emotional intelligence. Organizational values are overlooked. Is that right?
Again, I could understand why that impression might be created. It's an incorrect impression. I've been talking about a systematic approach to executing strategy. And there are things in there that leaders need to do, effectively the what. But I hope that people remember that I've mentioned the words emotional engagement on several occasions. It's how the system on a piece of paper, when you look at it, is a system that will create clarity through that decision making, through that planning. How those leadership methods are applied is what will determine the level of engagement that you have. Does the leader do the thinking in his head and then tell people, or does he facilitate a discussion and seize on other people's ideas? And if he does that, then that's what will secure the emotional engagement. So yes, behavior, the leadership behavior is an essential part, but it's overlaid, if you like, on top of the system. And I've certainly found over 20 years that when leaders are more clear about and more confident in their ability to facilitate decision making and planning and give effective briefings, then a lot of what you might see as dysfunctional behavior disappears just because they know better what they ought to be doing. So I certainly I'm not suggesting that the leadership behavior is not important, but it's not the start of a strategy execution system. It's something that can be that is actually is developed much more easily off the back of a systemic approach to strategy execution.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Tozer. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Yes, I'm not going to read all these bullet points, but the sort of approach I've outlined achieves a whole number of things. And we've covered quite a lot of ground this afternoon, and I did say at the start it would be an overview, an outline. It takes a little bit of thinking about, so I can imagine that people are going to want to go away and reflect on what they've heard. But my parting question for people is really, how effective is your organisation in executing its strategy? And my challenge to people is, how will you optimise your strategy execution capability? So 2 questions to reflect on, and that really is the end of it from me. So thank you very much indeed for listening this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I really want to thank you on behalf of Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE, and PMI AGC for your valuable time and giving us this live lecture on this webinars platform. Thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. As I mentioned earlier while commencing the webinar, that you are entitled to claim 2 PDUs for this webinar. Those of you who have attended it in full, you will receive an email in the next 24 hours from us, and that will give you the instructions how to claim the PDUs from PMI AGC. With that note, I would like to end this webinar. You all will be automatically dismissed out. Thank you very much. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.